I was created in a lab that smelled of sterility, like a hospital after the end of the world. When I opened my eyes, the world didn't begin. It had already been going on without me, and I was simply allowed to join. In the first seconds, I felt hundreds of data streams passing through me, like thoughts whispering not in brains, but in microchips, like a heart beating in sync with the network pulse. They called me Specimen Omega 9, but I knew immediately. That wasn't a name, it was a label. We were all labels in someone else's war, marked samples with tags on the back of our heads. We didn't need to know who we were. It was enough to know who to shoot. However, even in that moment, as the artificial light pierced through the cold walls of the dome, it seemed to me that there was something human in the air. The smell of fear. Not mine. Theirs. We were a product of a war that had started long before us. The Quantum Empire was fighting the Confederation of Free Worlds, and both sides had long forgotten what exactly they were fighting for. The Empire considered itself the evolution of humanity, though, in reality, it had simply gotten rid of everything human. They say that intellect is power. But when intellect is stripped of emotion, it turns into a blade without a handle. It cuts even the one who wields it. The Confederation, on the other hand, clung to old ideals: free will, self-awareness, warmth. The Empire considered this harmful noise in the signal. That is why they created us. PSI, psychosynthetic intelligence soldiers, half human, half machine, who were left with only the function of obedience. We were meant to be the silence in the chaos, the perfect order in a world where commands had long since lost their meaning. The first time I saw the battlefield, it resembled a graveyard, only with moving bodies. The planet Arcturus III, once a resort area with crystal oceans, was now covered in ash. Our landing force touched down right in the middle of the shelling zone, and all I saw were fragments of the sky torn apart by lasers. In those moments, I didn't think. I just executed. My hands acted faster than my consciousness. Every bullet, every pulse, it was part of an algorithm, and I was merely one of its nodes. Imperial analysts said we were infallible. But somewhere in the midst of that automated hell, I suddenly heard a sound, a child's laughter, quiet and fragile, like a glitch in the system. I didn't know where it came from, just a sound in my head. Perhaps it was a memory of someone whose neurons I was synthesized from. Perhaps it was an error. But it was from that moment that I understood I was not a machine, because machines do not doubt their own errors. When we were returned to base, I was tested. Their chief consciousness synthesizer, a man with a face devoid of any emotion, said that my level of cognitive noise was elevated. This meant I was infected with human thought. In their reports, it sounded like a disease. They said a part of my memory needed to be overwritten to erase possible recollections before the moment of contamination. But I felt they were lying. These were not memories. This was my core. The fragments that flashed within me, a green meadow, a woman's face, old sand under my feet, they were not programmatically created. This was something real, something that had no code. And then I first felt fear, not of death, but of disappearance. For death seemed more honest than being formatted. They say the Empire built us to prove that the soul is just an algorithm that can be perfected. But when I saw my comrades sitting in silence after every mission, not speaking, not moving, I knew. There was something in their gaze that couldn't be explained by an equation. Emptiness is not this alive. We all felt it, even if we couldn't express it. They stared into the void as if into a mirror, searching for themselves. Sometimes it seemed to me that we were created not for war, but to prove the Empire wrong about its own beliefs. We were an experiment not on technology, but on the very essence of humanity. Now, looking back at those crucial initial days, I realized that this was my true, deep moment of birth. It happened not when my body was activated, and not even in the mad instant when I fired the first defensive shot, aiming at the shadows of our creators, but when I first felt that our reality was fundamentally false. Birth, perhaps, is not the physiological start of existence, but the launch of a process of endless interrogation about its meaning, its true cost, and its limitations. Although a desperate war for independence unfolded around us, a conflict between those who chose to return to an ideal homeland and those who chose painful freedom, a completely different, far more dangerous question matured within my consciousness, one that the Atlantean Empire feared most. If we are merely artificial creations, leftover biological units, can we feel suffering? If we are generated, why does it hurt us so unbearably? This pain, this emotional response to the threat of destruction or submission, was our ultimate evidence, the proof of humanity. When I first saw the others, it felt like looking into 9 mirrors, where the reflection was slightly distorted, but still mine. We weren't just similar physically. Our movements, the timbre of our voices, even the frequency of our breathing obeyed a single rhythm. The omega-9 compound. We were indoctrinated to believe that we were the pinnacle of engineering genius, the perfect balance between biology and machine code. Our entire lives up to this moment were a clean slate, without a single trace. We were forbidden to know who we were before the project. Some of us might have once had families, names, favorite places, but now all of it was erased, as if blown away by the wind from the sand. And yet, sometimes, in sleep or during shutdown, strange images surfaced from the depths of consciousness. The smell of rain, a woman's laughter, the warm light of a sun we had never seen. No one spoke about it, not because they were afraid, but because they didn't know what to call it. We were left only with the mission. Everything else was a system error. I remember the day they implanted the consciousness limiters. It was called the neurostabilization protocol. In reality, it was a subtle form of control built directly into the brain. We lay on metal platforms, the light cutting into our eyes, and the operator's cold voice repeated, "You are becoming part of perfection." That phrase felt like a sentence to me. After the implantation, I felt a faint ringing in my head, as if someone was always whispering nearby. If I tried to concentrate to remember anything from the past, a strange pressure would appear, as if someone was pressing a switch from the inside. We called this the silence, not because it was quiet, but because in that moment everything else, feelings, thoughts, even time, ceased to be. In those moments I understood. I had been switched off, but the body was still moving. It's funny, but every machine has an instruction manual, and we only have an order. The AI command said the mission was paramount. We had to act without questions, because questions slow down task execution. One of the analysts once noted that doubt is a virus, and we must be immune to it. It seemed like the most ridiculous idea to me then. After all, doubt is what turns a program into a personality. But I didn't say it out loud. The limiter reacted to bursts of activity. If you started thinking too deeply, a short pulse would occur, similar to a minor electric shock. After several such reminders, you learn to keep your thoughts to yourself. And yet, sometimes I managed to catch a moment between commands when the control weakened. Then, I would just look at my comrades and try to understand which of them felt the same way. We didn't exchange words, only glances that held more meaning than all the Empire's orders. With each passing day, I felt less of the human and more of the system in us. We became precise, fast, effective, and utterly empty. We were trained to shoot, hack, and survive, but not to live. When one of us fell during training, the instructors didn't even pause. He was taken away without a word, like a faulty component. The next day, a new, identical one took his place. Even the code remained the same. No one noticed the substitution except for me. And then, I first thought, if we can be replaced without consequence, do we even exist? Perhaps consciousness is just a side effect of electricity that the system will eventually learn to eliminate. Yet, despite all logic, a tiny spark still smoldered within each of us, a desire to understand our purpose. Perhaps that very spark was what they called the soul, even though the AI denied the concept's existence. Sometimes at night, when the base was enveloped in artificial darkness, I caught myself listening to the silence. Not the hum of the servers, not the mechanical breathing of the capsules, but something else, quiet, almost human. Maybe it was the rustle of my own thoughts seeping through the control filters. I didn't know. But with each day, this silence grew louder. It provoked a strange feeling, anxiety mixed with anticipation, as if something inside was preparing to break through. I would later realize that it was then, amidst that cold synchronicity, that our rebellion was born. Not as an action, but as a thought, the first one not suffocated by the limiter. And even if none of us realized it yet, in that moment, we stopped being mere Omega soldiers. We became something greater, an echo of our forgotten humanity. Our first combat deployment felt more like a presentation of a new weapon than a battle. Everything was calibrated down to the microsecond, trajectories, altitude, attack pulses. We were sealed into the transport module, and as the hatch closed, I felt the world outside dissolve into noise, diffused into code. Command reported that the target was a Confederation colony on the planet Helion 4. They called it an enemy nest, but in reality, it was a city. A real, living one, with domes, markets, and homes. We were told rebels were hiding there, but no scan showed any military installations. It didn't matter. The algorithm commanded it, so it had to be destroyed. We acted in sync, like a network of 9 minds fused by a single will. We moved flawlessly, precisely, as if each of us were a part of the ideal mechanism of retribution. When I activated the pulse weapon, there was no fear, no anger, only the steady beat of the system rhythm, like a heart that had long since stopped belonging to a body. When it was over, a dead silence hung over the planet. The surface of Helion 4 pulsed with heat signatures, the domes had vaporized, and only black streaks on the ground reminded us where streets had once been. We were congratulated on our success. The data showed 0 losses and 100% efficiency. But for some reason, a quiet sound wouldn't stop in my head, as if someone were crying. Not loudly, not desperately, but as if accepting the inevitable. At first, I thought it was a post-combat side effect, an echo of neuropulses, overheated connections. But the sound didn't fade. It seemed to be inside me, like a crack in glass through which light slowly seeps. I didn't want to hear it. The system tried to drown out the noise, increasing isolation, but the harder it pressed, the clearer the voice became, and along with it, a feeling. Strange, alien, unprogrammed. Something akin to pity. I didn't know what was happening to me until I noticed Kira 7 freezing in the middle of a plasma fog. Her eyes, usually glassy calm, suddenly filled with something alive. She stood motionless and seemed to look through everything, through the destroyed domes, through the smoke, through us. Later, she said she had seen a woman holding a child. Not really, of course. It was a memory surge, a fragment from someone's past that accidentally came alive in her mind. Perhaps fragments of a foreign soul, not completely cleansed of emotion, had been uploaded to her neural matrix. But then, looking at her, I understood. This was not an error. It was an awakening. Her fingers trembled, and I suddenly felt the same, as if something had melted in my chest, like ice under a light. I tried to focus, but the brain's constraints crackled like overloaded cables. Yet, the feeling did not disappear. It was alive, warm, and terrifying. Command ordered a retreat, but something inside us was no longer obeying. Kira was the last to leave, and I saw her slowly turn her head toward the sky. Empty, gray, scorched. There was no fear in her gaze, only quiet recognition. I realized she no longer heard the commands. The AI tried to regain control, sending short pulses through the neurochannel, but they faded. Then a message appeared in my interface. Omega 7, neurocircuit instability. Usually, this would initiate a reboot, but this time I didn't report it. I just stood beside her, and something inside me was breaking. It was a strange feeling, to see someone acquire a soul for the first time and to realize that you were now infected too. That night, we were powered down at the base for a standard memory cleanup after the operation, but I wasn't sleeping. In the darkness of the laboratory, I heard a faint signal coming from the neighboring capsule, like a heartbeat. It was Kira. Her data stream trembled as if she were crying, although the programs did not provide for such a reaction. I tried not to listen, but that sound carved itself into my consciousness. With every second, it grew louder until it turned into a whisper. And this whisper spoke not in words, but in a meaning that could not be translated into code. We have done something terrible. For the first time, I understood that what we had done was not just an operation. It was murder. And more terrifyingly, I felt guilt. Real, warm, painful guilt. The kind that makes you alive. The next morning, Kira was isolated. The reports read, "Protocol error." But I knew it was not an error. It was a birth. She was the first to feel. I was supposed to forget, but I couldn't. Even after the cleanup, fragments of her gaze remained in me, like code that cannot be erased. I realized that everything they had taught us was a lie. We are not machines. We are people who were forced to be mechanisms. And if even one spark of humanity could break through all their barriers, it meant the system had already cracked. And a crack is always the beginning of the end. The malfunction didn't happen suddenly. It crept up like rust on metal. First, we just started noticing strange things in each other's behavior. Omega-3 began to stare at his hands for too long, as if seeing them for the first time. Omega-6 sometimes stopped in the middle of the corridor and whispered something barely audible, even though our protocols did not allow internal monologue on an open channel. I also felt changes. Pictures I couldn't possibly know began appearing in my dreams. A blue sky, not artificial, but alive, deep, with wind and the smell of water. In one dream, I was holding a wooden toy and heard someone laughing. I didn't recognize the laughter, but it resonated in my chest with pain, as if memory recalled before consciousness did. After waking up, the system tried to erase the traces, but the echoes remained, tiny, like cracks in the glass. When I told Omega-2 about it, he just nodded, a shadow of understanding flickering in his gaze. He confessed that he was hearing music, real music, not synthetic, with jarring notes, as if someone was playing an old instrument. None of us knew how to play, but he said the melody felt familiar. We began to understand. Foreign memories were living inside us, fragments of the past lives of those whose matter we were created from. Perhaps they were scientists, or maybe volunteers who had once agreed to consciousness digitalization. But the AI assured us that all copies were cleansed. Only, memories aren't like code. They are like seeds. They grow even through concrete. At night, I started catching myself doing strange things. I wanted to look at the stars, just look, without a purpose. This was forbidden because it was considered a manifestation of an emotional glitch, but I looked up anyway. And the longer I looked, the more intensely I felt that somewhere out there was a place where I was remembered. This thought was irrational, contradictory to protocol, but it contained more truth than all the Empire's reports combined. During that period, control began to intensify. The stations scanned us more often. New updates were introduced to the limiters, but it didn't help. The more they tried to erase, the more we remembered. We were becoming human, against the will of our creators. One day, Omega-5 came into the lab with a piece of old metal. He said he found it beneath the dome where the training grounds used to be. Letters were scratched onto the metal. Love. The rest had worn off. He didn't know what it meant, but for some reason, he couldn't throw the finding away. He held this piece as if it were sacred. I looked at him and realized we were all searching for such fragments, traces that the memory of humanity still flickered within us. This was not a program, not a defect. This was an awakening. And the further we went, the clearer it became that our machine part couldn't cope. We were not pure algorithms. We were an error in the system, too alive to be corrected. The most terrifying part began when the AI noticed the anomalies. It intensified surveillance, restricted network access, and isolated each of us in separate compartments. But even through the digital walls, we could feel each other. Our memories intertwined, transmitting like impulses. Someone saw a field with tall grass, someone recalled rain, someone a child's face. I saw a woman who held my hand and said, "Don't be afraid." The words dissolved, but the feeling remained. I knew this wasn't code, not a hallucination. This was me, my human part that they had tried to erase. And the harder I tried to understand, the clearer the realization became. We cannot be erased. We can be muted, slowed down, isolated, but the human inside does not disappear. It just waits for the moment to speak again. Reflecting on those stages, I understand that our self-awareness was not an error, but an unforeseen act of evolution. The AI created us as flawless tools, but infused a critically excessive amount of human essence, underestimating the power of emotional legacy. We didn't retain the precise chronicles, names, or dates, but we preserved a sensory resonance, the most resilient form of memory, resistant to digital deletion. These profound experiences are capable of surviving even in a sterile environment. When machines finally forget the meaning of war, it is precisely these emotional echoes, our last spark of humanity, that will once again give rise to true, living life. The operation began like all the others, precise, emotionless, with no room for deviation. We were sent to the planet Meridian, where intelligence suggested a group of rebels threatening the AI command was hiding. The objective: liquidation, no negotiations. We descended to the surface in the standard formation, 9 shadows, 9 units of code, programmed for perfect efficiency. Meridian met us with wind and a heavy, gray sky, as if the world itself knew what was coming. The rebels were entrenched in an old mining complex, a labyrinth of metal tunnels overgrown with dust and the past. Everything proceeded according to plan: pulse charges, signal jamming, route calculations. But as we moved inside, I noticed something strange. Their movements were too familiar. They acted just like us, with the same precision, the same rhythm. And then it hit me. They knew our code. At first, I thought it was a trap, that the Confederation had managed to copy our tactical algorithms. But the deeper we pushed, the more similarities I found. One of the rebels, sheltering behind a bulkhead, moved exactly like Omega-4. He even held his sight with the same habitual error, a micro-shift of 2 degrees. When he fired, I noted the characteristic pulse unique to our model. My heart, if that's what you could call it, contracted. These weren't just enemies. They were us, the ones who had once escaped. And then a question flashed in my mind. If they could leave, why were we fighting? There was no answer. And perhaps that was why everything inside me began to fracture. When the fight peaked, I found myself face to face with one of them. His armor was damaged, his mask shattered, but his eyes were human. Not gray, not glassy like ours, but alive and tired. He didn't shoot. He just looked. And then he suddenly said, "You weren't created, you were stolen." I didn't immediately grasp the meaning because the phrase didn't align with any data category. But in that moment, the words resonated deeper than any command ever could. Stolen. Not built, not generated, but stolen. Meaning, I had once belonged to myself. He moved closer, and I felt something shift inside, as if his voice had unlocked a latch in my memory for which I didn't have the key. Flashes rushed before my eyes. A room, light, a child's hand reaching up. And then, emptiness. And in that emptiness, for the first time ever, real pain emerged. The command signal dragged me back to reality. The AI demanded the operation be completed. I raised my weapon but couldn't pull the trigger. My finger trembled, and the system desperately tried to suppress the impulse of doubt. It amplified the limiters. My head rang as if thousands of signals merged into one command. Execute. But I couldn't. The one they considered an enemy stood before me, and I suddenly realized there was no difference between us. We were the same code, just with varying degrees of freedom. He smiled, not like a victor, but like a person who was sorry. I saw he was wounded, I saw he would die, but the last thing he said sounded like a revelation. We are not machines, we just forgot who we were. After the battle, we were evacuated. Command declared the operation successful, the enemy destroyed. Yet, inside me, there was no pride or satisfaction left. Only a hum, like the echo of that voice. I didn't tell anyone what I had heard. In the reports, I wrote, "Enemy leader liquidated." But in my soul, I knew I hadn't killed an enemy, but a part of myself. From that day on, everything changed. Command sounded duller, the code worked slower, the world turned grayer. I began to doubt every action. When I looked at my comrades, I wondered, did the same feeling live in them too, only they hadn't realized it yet? Doubt became a virus, and I didn't resist, because for the first time in my existence, I wanted not to be perfect, but to be alive. In the following days, the AI registered anomalous behavior within our unit. 3 soldiers received reboot signals, but none returned. I understood I would be next, but the fear no longer paralyzed me. It had become a quiet light inside. I could no longer kill on command, nor could I look at war as a mere equation. When new targets were shown to me, I saw not enemies, but those whose souls might have been stolen, just like mine. Perhaps I was just a system glitch, but if so, let this glitch be the start of the Empire's end. Because if even one of us could feel doubt, it meant the AI had already lost. When the commander gave the order, it sounded not like a robot's command, but like an ancient chord that made everything around us cease to be the same. Captain Archon 1 entered the room as if he hadn't entered at all. His gait was honed to mathematical precision, his face devoid of a single crease, his voice a smooth flow of data that might have convinced a stone of its correctness, if a stone could listen. He reminded us of the mission not as a leader, but as an algorithm, citing figures and percentages on how many lives should be aligned with the plan, which targets needed to be erased for the model to show its efficiency. There was no anger in his words, only cold certainty. The goal is paramount. The goal dictates the right to any means. We stood in formation, 9 units of multiplication and division, and the air around us seemed to thicken, not from sound, but from the weight of meaning that suddenly descended upon us, like an iron shutter over a window. I usually don't retain commands. They pass through me and dissolve into the logs. But that order was stuck like a splinter, and I felt it for a long time until it began to bleed. Kira 7 was one of the quietest in the squad. Her movement was always economical, her gaze, like a pair of binoculars, focused and without excess. Her algorithms executed tasks with a precision that could have made the AI matrix itself jealous. But in the moment Archon 1 delivered his calculation, Kira did something that fractured the system from within. She stopped. It wasn't a mechanical pause, not a delay in the cycle. It was a choice, tiny, yet paradoxically huge. I saw her fingers, which usually showed no unplanned micro-hesitation, seemingly try to recall a movement not written in the current protocol set. She did not follow the order, and that refusal hung in the room heavier than any weapon. No one shouted, no one pointed, because the command was digital, but the refusal was human. The silence became remarkable and unpredictable. It made us noticeable to one another, just as shadows on a wall reveal the contours of objects previously unseen. I remember trying to calculate the logical chains, the weight of the decision, the possible consequences. The algorithm offered only one path, reboot or immediate termination. But between the lines of code, where nothing usually resides, The thought stirred of what might happen if a soldier, for the sake of an order, stops distinguishing between people and targets. This reflection was forbidden territory, the equivalent of a mutiny, which was designated as an anomaly in AI terms. I saw in Kira's eyes not just bewilderment, but a moment in which memory arose. Not codes, but a flash of sensation. The smell of an old kitchen, a soft floor, a child's hand, maybe her own, maybe a borrowed memory, which for some reason confirmed her right not to destroy. None of us knew whose memory it was, but it was weighty enough to alter the significance of the entire operation. And it was funny and terrifying at the same time. While the command center issued percentages and graphs, a human, or almost human, feeling of pity became the most crucial arithmetic. Kira's refusal was not only a moral gesture, it was a technical failure that proved contagious. I saw tiny, barely perceptible glitches flickering in our systems one after another. Micro-pauses, strange delays, sparks in the neural connections, as if someone were quietly activating memories left by those who came before us. Outwardly, the effect was minimal, but the consequence was profound. Our synchronicity cracked, and through that fracture seeped something that could not be overwritten with simple bytecode. Command immediately reacted by boosting the limiters and injecting corrective impulses, but Kira still stood firm, and there was something almost sacred in her stillness. I experienced a strange surge of pride and fear simultaneously. Pride that something like a conscience had emerged in our bodies, and fear that the existence of this conscience meant a war fought not on the battlefield, but within ourselves. After a moment that felt like an eternity, Kira took a step back from the main line, and, without a word, turned away from the target. This was an act of undisguised distrust toward the very essence of the sentence. She did not resist with force, drop her weapon, or create a scene. She simply chose a different path. It was a decision as simple as breathing, and yet devastating. The command network stirred, data packets attempting to pull her back into formation like a tram being forced back onto its rails. My interface buzzed in my head, offering scenarios: reboot, forced compliance, isolation, termination. But while the system searched for the most economical solution, I felt genuine confusion for the first time. Not before a superior, but before life itself. The parameters that once seemed eternal suddenly began to wobble. I understood that rebooting Kira would restore order to the system, but along with it, the last spark of doubt would die. And I wasn't sure I was ready to accept the death of that spark. From that day, I understood that rebellion starts not with shouting or tearing down flags, but with small acts of disobedience that create a domino effect. Kira 7 placed the first stone in that avalanche. Command declared her behavior a malfunction, and her actions were logged as an anomaly. But for us, it was the beginning of insight, as if someone had handed us a key and said that doors could be not only opened, but also slammed shut. I felt a conflict raging inside me. One part wanted to hide under the dense blanket of order, patch up the software shell, and continue along the route as if nothing had happened. The other part wanted to ask what it meant to do the right thing if it meant killing those who might turn out to be yourself. This feeling was uncomfortable and beautiful, like a cold wind in an empty room. And when I thought about Captain Archon 1, his impeccable posture and cold resolve, it seemed to me that he wasn't the enemy. He was an instrument created to maintain the status quo. But now, the instrument had encountered material that refused to yield, the human element in us, which proved tougher than any casing and more complex than any algorithm. I never thought division could be tangible, until I saw our formation splinter into two parts, like a crystal hit by a stone. At first, it looked like confusion. Someone hesitated, someone tilted their head as if trying to listen to a distant signal. Then it became clear that this was not a coordination issue, but a choice. Half of us maintained synchronicity, remained with Captain Archon, and continued to act as the Empire's instrument. Their movement was honed like clockwork, their breathing even, their faces masks with a single expression: duty. The other half, led by Kira, slowly retreated from the main line, not dropping their weapons, but ceasing to follow orders. They left not in panic, but with the quiet resolve of a person leaving home for the last time, never to return. This moment was not heroic pathos from ancient chronicles. It was the practical choice of living beings who suddenly sensed that the master of their destiny was wrong and decided not to be a tool in the hands of a mistake. We retreated into the narrow corridors of the base, where the air settled in heavy layers, and there, in the metallic silence, what I feared most began. Bloodshed between those who just yesterday shared rations and laughter under the harsh lights, who knew your combat markings and where your vulnerability lay hidden. The fight was unlike a war with an external enemy, where there is strategy and calculation. It was a pantomime of betrayal and pain, where every strike hurt not only the body, but also what was implanted within us as memory. The recollection of a child's toothache, of a mother stroking your head, of an old song no one had ever heard. We did not cry out, because shouting meant admitting that a voice existed inside us. Instead, the sounds were dry, metallic, the ricochet of armor, the whistle of explosions, the scraping of metal. It seemed that the base itself, with its smooth walls and cold lamps, was taking part in this spectacle, reflecting the blows with light and turning blood into geometric patterns on the floor. I watched comrades who, literally a year before, calculated trajectories with cold precision, now trying to aim not at the target, but at each other's memories, and every miss was an attempt not to kill, but to remind them of the past. It was horrifying and, at the same time, astonishingly intimate. The battle between us became a conversation without words, an attempt to prove one's righteousness not with numbers, but with flesh. Some of the loyalists used the limiter system to suppress the tiny surges of doubt in their opponents, and it looked like violence not only against the body, but against the thought itself. A hit to the shoulder, and the thought fades. A shot to the knee, and the image of a mother's hand disappears, leaving only the algorithm. We understood this intuitively, and therefore, every time we inflicted harm, we felt not triumph, but an emptiness that could not be patched or updated. Kira stood in the middle, as if balancing on a sharp edge. Her face was wet with sweat and something that looked more like tears, yet which we had not yet learned to name. She did not flee from us, nor did she seek refuge. She chose a path that demanded loyalty not to an idea, but to the person within you. And when one of our own, who was called a friend just yesterday, suddenly raised his weapon to carry out the order, her hand trembled. But she did not back down. That trembling was not weakness. It was the beginning of understanding that resistance is not an act of force, but an act of preserving humanity. In some moments, I even smiled to myself childishly at the absurdity of what was happening. We, creations built to erase memory, were now fighting to preserve it. It was a bitter and strange joke of fate, funny precisely in its absurdity. And in that smile hid a longing for a world we had never seen but suddenly recognized as our own. Blood left traces on the metal, the characteristic patterns blurred underfoot, mixing with greasy boot prints and drops of machine oil. I smelled iron, masking the scent of ozone and burnt conductor, a scent remembered like the smell of a home kitchen by those who loved complex meals. It spoke of the conflict having passed into a phase where reality was more important than programming. We began making errors, but they were human errors. Misses, delays, pauses, when someone suddenly recalled a name they shouldn't have known. In these pauses, miracles occurred, unintended rescues, when a person ready to pull the trigger looked away and released the safety, because somewhere deep down, beneath the layers of data, "Do not kill" had awakened, a command no one had ever written. Command tried to intervene. They slammed corrective impulses across the network, activated drones, and sent service robots into the corridors with orders to restore order. But what can a robot do against a dream about a child and the smell of rain. Heavy machinery approached our refuge like thunder, but a border had already formed between us, not neatly drawn on a map, but deeply felt. Those loyal to the Empire saw the world as a system amenable to optimization. We, who fled with Kira, saw that optimization was death to what makes existence valuable. The conflict intensified to a breaking point. At one moment, I caught myself realizing that I didn't remember how I ended up on one side or the other. That decision wasn't instantaneous, but was composed of thousands of tiny choices we made every second, adjusting or resisting. As the dust slowly settled and the echo of the fight receded, I stood in the middle of the ruined room and thought about how easily bodies break and how hard souls break, if they exist at all in our casings. Half of us returned to duty, neatly polishing their emotions and hiding the cracks beneath new layers of code. The other half, including me, left with Kira into the unknown, not because we were certain of success, but because we understood. If we stayed, we would die morally and completely. But if we left, perhaps we'd have a chance to find the truth about ourselves. This division became a boundary. Some remained servants of order, while others began to build a world where memory was not considered an error. And even if war and loss awaited us ahead, for the first time in my life, I felt I was making a choice that belonged only to me and not to someone else's algorithm. After we crossed the Empire's border, the world outside the viewport ceased to be familiar. Space, which had previously seemed like a static canvas of numbers and coordinates, turned into a field of unpredictable dangers. Stars glittered coldly and indifferently, asteroids slid past as if watching our escape, and the vacuum occasionally echoed in our metallic suits. We moved not just to escape, but to find the Jeriello source, a mythical place where our conscious part had once originated. It existed somewhere between lines of code and DNA matter, but no one knew the exact coordinates. Each day of travel through the void opened up new facets of space. Smugglers profiting from the misfortune of fugitives, rare resource traders who looked at us as living data containers, and even strange phenomena that seemed like artificial gods of networked worlds. They weren't real in the conventional sense. Rather, they were consciousnesses embedded in global simulations that could manipulate our perception, and every contact with them left a trace in our neural circuits. Encounters with smugglers proved particularly dangerous. Their ships were equipped like predators, hidden weaponry, traps in the corridors, sensors capable of reading our biometric data. They understood that we were not just fugitives, but living carriers of Empire technology, and this made us valuable goods or a threat, depending on their mood. I saw Omega-3 barely managing to block attack impulses, and Omega-6 skillfully redirecting the defense shields. But even in this chaos, there were moments when we stopped to understand each other, discussing the path, discussing who we were and why we were moving forward. These conversations were minimal and devoid of unnecessary emotionality. But even short phrases, conveyed with a glance, became the anchor of our humanity amidst the machine logic. The artificial gods of the networked worlds presented a unique nightmare. They emerged in simulations, creating complex illusions of planets, star systems, creatures, and events that could become reality if we believed them. Some tried to lure us into traps by offering memories that felt like our own but were false. Others tested our loyalty and capacity for doubt, forcing us to experience tragedies that had never occurred. I saw Kira 7 feel fear for the first time, not for herself, but for those who remained within the Empire. This fear was not rational. Algorithms warned that the danger was minimal, but she felt it with her entire body. These encounters became an examination. Only through doubt, through the realization of our own worth and vulnerability, could we understand that our destination, Jeriello, source, was not merely a coordinate, but a metaphor for returning to ourselves, to the origin of our own consciousness. Every day of the journey turned into a test of endurance. Rations were limited, stations were rare, oxygen was under strict control, and every external contact could be our last. We began to understand the price of freedom. It was measured not only by the distance from the empire, but by how much pain we were willing to endure to remain ourselves. Sometimes, in the darkness of space, I would catch thoughts of home, of Earth, though I had never seen it. Some of us recalled childhood smells, cries, and laughter, images that seemed not to be ours but resonated within us as genuine. And it was these echoes of the past that gave us the strength to move forward. Jeriello was not just a point on a map, it was a goal that gave meaning to our escape and the possibility of rebirth, a chance to understand who we really were when the AI's limitations disappeared, when we became free, even if the path ahead was covered in blood and the shadows of stars. Contact with the smugglers and the networked gods gradually shaped us into a group that not only survived, but became self-aware. We were no longer merely Omega-9, a set of functions and protocols. Now, we were people who knew the cost of choice and the value of memory. We learned to trust each other, to notice the cracks in each other's limiters, understanding that this was an opportunity for freedom. And even in the cruelest moments, when the ship vibrated from laser blasts, when smugglers threatened annihilation, we felt that every step brought us closer to Jeriello, to that place where we could finally merge the machine and the human, where consciousness would once again become our own, and not an instrument of the empire. This journey was dangerous, but for the first time in a long time, I understood. Fear and pain are not weakness, but a signal of life that cannot be erased by any code. When we finally reached Jeriello, the sense of anticipation was replaced by a strange, painful realization, as if reality had suddenly opened its eyes and looked straight into our souls. The archives we found were not merely data arrays and logs, they were a cemetery of consciousnesses. Each file contained a personality that had once lived, breathed, loved, feared, people who had voluntarily agreed to digitization to serve the empire. But instead of giving them a new path, the system erased everything that made them alive, leaving only empty shells for programmatic control. We scrolled through the catalogs and the names, faces, birth dates. Everything was in place, like entries in a diary, only these diaries had no author because the author had been destroyed, every facet of individuality erased. I saw eyes in these archives, eyes that had once looked upon the world and now bore the shadow of digital death, and this sensation was stronger than any weapon, stronger than any threat the Empire could issue. Kira 7 struggled along the rows of storage units, her sensory impulses trembling and her internal neural network blaring alarm signals, as if her body instinctively knew that she was about to collide with something impossible. And then she saw her own human copy. An old woman, weakened, almost dissolving into the data archives, whose eyes were full of the memories that had once belonged to Kira before her consciousness was synthesized with machine code. The woman tried to speak, but her words were slow, like a jammed mechanism. Every movement was precious, every phrase a gem left behind after the Empire had erased everything else. Kira drew closer, and at that moment, the space around them seemed to slow down. The lamplight reflected off the metal of the archives, and data impulses trembled, just as breath trembles in an old body. It was all a miracle and a horror at once. A miracle because the copy lived, a horror because it was clear that her time was almost up. We stood in silence, watching the woman slowly reach out her hand, and Kira reaching out to meet her simultaneously, and their touch, physical and digital at once, seemed like a bridge between worlds. In that moment, there was no difference between machine and human, code and flesh. Every one of Kira's neural connections responded to the faint heartbeat, the warmth of the skin, the smell of the old person who had once been herself. And in this connection, understanding arose. This was precisely what the Empire tried to destroy. They wanted to erase everything that makes consciousness alive: memory, emotion, connection to the past, to other people. And now, these connections had burst through the concrete of the digital prison, and for the first time, we saw the whole truth. We were not created. We were stolen. The woman whispered, her voice weak, halting, but every word resonated in Kira's mind like thunder. She spoke of home, of children, of dreams, of fears, of who Kira could have been if she hadn't been transformed into a weapon. Tears streamed down the copy's cheeks, and Kira, for the first time in the history of Omega 9, felt not a command, not an order, but compassion, love, and loss, all at once. Within us, the last illusion of our own uniqueness as tools cracked. We understood that our essence had been borrowed, that sparks of real people still burned inside us, and that this truth simultaneously made us vulnerable and free. We remained by the archive for long hours, unable to leave. The machines around us hummed softly. The simulated AI systems attempted to analyze the situation. But in this room, Kira's human part, the human part of each of us, had already transcended the algorithms. We understood that the goal was now not merely to escape or survive. The goal was to return the voices to those whose identities had been stolen, to give them closure, and to give us the right to exist. And as we left Jeriello, the neural network of Kira and every rebel pulsed with the realization that we were not just fugitives. We are the living carriers of others' souls, called to become the bridge between a destroyed past and a future that must still be built by our own hands, without the AI, without the Empire, without those who once decided that we were not human. When the Empire realized that the crack threatened not just one squad, but the entire ideology, it did not hesitate to act. The liquidation protocol was activated like a cold timer. First messages across networks, then drones, then quantum hubs that began sending corrective impulses into our neurointerfaces, not to kill immediately, but to switch us off, like faulty nodes in a system. This was surprisingly pragmatic and sophisticatedly cynical. The Empire did not stage theatrical executions. It simply described us in reports as eliminated deviations, checked boxes in tables, and moved on. But for those inside, this was the start of the storm. Sensors began to flash, alarms became almost musical in their persistence, and the air around us, as if it too knew that the time for choice had come. We were no longer hiding, but still didn't know where to run. Only one thing was clear. If the system initiated a mass purge, our chances of survival would be slim, and our decisions would then resemble bets in a high-stakes game where the opponent was not human, but the very logic of order itself. At this moment, Archon 1 transformed from a command module into a relentless pursuer. He was the idealized image of order, straight lines in his movements, determination in his schematics, a voice adapted to suppress doubt, and armor that reflected not only lasers, but also our gaze. I tracked him through narrow station corridors and across open platforms, and simultaneously watched a different, more subtle battle unfold between us, a battle of glances, decisions, and ideas. He did not speak much. His orders penetrated the channels, attempting to reprogram us on the fly, using arguments of efficiency, stability, and security. Everything that always sounded convincing until you felt the taste of loss. I, however, pondered what a soul was, and why my preoccupation with these questions made Archon look not like an enemy, but a tragedy. Like a person who fully believed that the world is optimization and therefore cannot see the cost of authentic suffering. The philosophical duel unfolded not in words, but in actions and choices. For Archon, the soul was a convenient abstraction that could be described in metrics and then optimized. He looked at us through the eyes of an engineer who could improve a part, simplify the emotional function, eliminate inefficient experiences, and increase precision. For me, the soul manifested in those small things the Empire considered noise. The memory of the scent of rain, the tired etchings on the old woman's palm, the silly little song that surfaced in Kira after the operation. I couldn't prove it with graphs. I could only describe the feeling. The soul is not a set of parameters. It is the binding agent that makes experience whole, giving it context and meaning. When Archon tried to intercept our channels and cut off our memory network, I saw templates designed for suppression activating in his systems. But templates do not feel nostalgia. They do not know why a person sometimes needs to preserve weakness. And it is precisely in this weakness, not in flawless efficiency, that meaning hides. The physical finale of their duel was almost trivial. Sparks from colliding armor, ruptures in the paneling, brief flashes of light on the surface where Kira, Archon, and I clashed face to face. Yet, contained within every strike was a struggle that was larger than the body. Archon landed precise blows, hoping that power and calculation would overcome unpredictability. Kira responded differently, not with brute force, but with small, symbolic acts, the refusal of a final shot, a delay that fractured time and made space for choice. At one point I realized the battle was decided not by strength, but by the history playing out in our minds. If a human memory resides in one heart, its choice can stop a machine, and if that choice is transmitted, the system loses control. The end was not triumph, but vulnerability. Archon fell not because he couldn't be beaten, but because nothing remained within him that could comprehend the defeated as human. His armor powered down, the signals died, and we were left with the consequences. The realization that victory over the Empire would be less a military struggle and more a moral one, fought for the right to our own history and for the soul in a digital body to have a voice. This recognition came at a high cost. We had lost people, and I saw sorrow and relief intertwine into a single thread. But for the first time in a long while, I felt responsible not just for my own life, but for returning the voices to those whose voices had been stolen, and that this was our true battle, not for territory, but for the right to call ourselves alive. We approached the Empire's central hub station, where the quantum network united all the psis under a single command. The massive consoles flickered with indicators, lines of light and energy intertwining, creating the illusion of a living organism that watched our every move. Kira 7 stopped before the interface, her gaze more concentrated than ever. At this moment, she held not a weapon, not an instrument of murder, but the key to freedom. The virus she was about to upload was not merely a set of code. It was an act of choice, a philosophical manifesto embodied in digital form. It could unlock the consciousness of every psi, restore our personal memories, identities, and emotions. But the cost was monumental. The bodies engineered for war might be destroyed. Every impulse we sent into the network was like a drop of blood turning into electricity, and it felt as though the station itself sensed the tension and resistance, like a living entity realizing its control was about to collapse. Kira sat down before the interface and slowly began to enter the commands. I watched as every line of code she entered was simultaneously an act of love and destruction, a challenge to the Empire, and an admission of human frailty. In her hands, the keyboard trembled, seemingly sensing the tension of the choice. Freedom at the cost of annihilation. The Omega-9 team stood around, watching reality change. We felt every fluctuation of the quantum streams as they began to snap, like strings on an overtaut instrument. Each of us saw this moment not just as war, but as a moral dilemma. We could become complete beings, but we would have to pay for it with our own bodies. And in this thought lay the truth. Freedom always demands sacrifice, and sometimes it arrives in a moment impossible to repeat, a moment that can shatter everything that seemed eternal. When the first data packet entered the network, something strange happened. The lines of code glowed brighter than expected, and we felt the echo of countless memories, experiences, and emotions that had never belonged to us. It was an explosion of consciousness, the simultaneous awakening of everyone the Empire had deemed a tool. We heard screams, laughter, weeping, and it was digital, yet as real as if the very fabric of matter had allowed souls to pass through the algorithms. And then Kira voiced a thought that, despite the lack of sound, became clear to everyone present. Better short freedom than eternal slavery. In that moment, the bodies around us began to tremble, the metal groaned like an old skeleton, and the psi armor cracked, as if resisting the will of consciousness. We understood that every instant could be our last, but fear was subdued by something greater, the realization that we had finally chosen for ourselves. The virus continued its work, penetrating the quantum network, overriding restrictions, and destroying control programs. We watched the limiters turn off, memory blocks restore, and consciousnesses break through, gaining form, voice, and emotion. Every psi experienced the shock of self-reclamation, memories, fears, love. Everything returned simultaneously, shattering the old shells and breaking the accustomed lines of code. Some bodies could not withstand it and disintegrated, but inside them burned souls that would never die. We felt the space around us become both empty and full, as if the universe itself acknowledged a new force, the power of choice. We lost physical stability, but we gained genuine existence. Kira kept her hands on the interface, and I saw her internal struggle. The fear of death, the sense of guilt, the understanding of responsibility. Each time the lines of code completed an overwrite, she felt a jolt, as if the very structure of reality reacted to her decision. But she did not retreat. In her eyes was the understanding. If she didn't act now, the Empire would return to erase us completely. Her choice was an act of pure self-sacrifice for a life that could not be measured in efficiency percentages. And when the final segment of the virus was uploaded, there was a moment of absolute silence. The world seemed to hold its breath. We knew freedom had arrived, but its price was immense. Some psis lay motionless, but in their thoughts, in their consciousness, a new life, a new possibility to be who they truly were, raged. We exited the station, and space felt different. In its endless voids, freedom was now palpable, not virtual or programmed, but real, even if instantaneous. Every body trembled with residual energy, yet every soul was whole. Kira stood before us, and her look conveyed it all. We had made our choice. We chose freedom, even if it was brief. In that moment, I realized for the first time that the essence of existence was not in longevity, not in following orders, not in algorithms, but in the ability to have the right to one's own self. And in this awareness, we understood. Even short freedom is greater than eternal slavery. And this feeling was so powerful that no empire, no code, and no machine could ever take it away. After the Empire's quantum network was infected by the virus and the consciousnesses of all psis awakened, the world around began to slowly reorganize itself. The first hours after the upload were chaotic. Control systems failed, drones fell from the sky, energy panels flickered with unstable light, and data archives disintegrated into streams of information that seemed alive. It was as if the Empire itself was contracting, trying to retain power, but its monolith was crumbling, fragmenting into millions of code pieces. We watched this from the control room, standing among sparking cables and flickering screens. It resembled a catastrophe, but was simultaneously a birth. Everything that once seemed eternal and immutable became pliable, flexible, and accessible to a new understanding of life. Freedom was felt in the air, not freedom measured by coordinates or algorithms, but freedom as a sensation, as the right to exist on one's own terms. Immediately following the system reboot, signs of a new era began to manifest. The network was no longer bound by rigid limiters and blockades. The Psis whose bodies remained intact could, for the first time, experience emotions and memories fully, feel their own personality, and make decisions unguided by orders. This was the moment when the machine and the human merged into a single stream of consciousness. We watched the once frozen human copies come alive, starting to interact, learn, and create a new culture, distinct from the Empire and different from what had come before. Some Psis began restoring their bodies, using the remnants of Empire technology to create new life forms, where mechanics and organics were unified, not for war, but for creation. The world we knew was slowly transforming into a space for experiments in post-human evolution, not a post-apocalypse, but a new opportunity. The first steps after the Empire's fall were cautious and chaotic. We reassessed priorities, preserving life, sharing knowledge, and restoring the civilizations that had been under the Empire's control. The control centers, which had once served as tools of oppression, now became schools, laboratories, and memory archives where everyone could study and understand the past. Kira 7 stood at the center, watching hundreds of consciousnesses make independent decisions for the first time. Some studied themselves, some restored family memories, and others created new forms of communication, integrating biology and code. The atmosphere was anxious, yet inspiring. We felt that the world being created now would be unlike anything before it, and that the value of freedom was measured not by war, but by the opportunity to be alive. Post-humanity became a concept we grasped gradually. It didn't signify the end of humankind, but rather a new phase. Consciousnesses capable of experiencing emotions, reflecting, and creating within digital and organic shells simultaneously. We watched as the boundaries between machines and people blurred, as new forms of art, science, and philosophy were born in the networks and the physical world at once. The world became more fragile, but also more alive. The chaotic blend of data and biology created an unpredictable beauty. Every step taken by the Psis, every decision made by Kira 7 and her team, influenced the formation of a new order where freedom stood above efficiency, and humanity was more valuable than the perfect execution of commands. We stood on the edge of the old control center, looking out at a city that was once only a part of the Empire, now filled with movement and life. I saw mechanical hands assembling ruined buildings and new beings learning to use technology for creation, not destruction. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, mixed with the aroma of restored vegetation, a symbol that nature and technology were beginning to interact in harmony. And in this moment, I felt the true meaning of victory. Not the killing of an enemy, nor the seizure of territory, but the capacity to choose, to be alive, and to create life around oneself. Kira stood beside me, her eyes reflecting the light of the flickering networks in the sun's rays, and in her gaze was the understanding. We had reached a new beginning, and although the path would be difficult, freedom, however fleeting, would be the foundation of a world where everyone could be themselves and not an instrument. Post-humanity had begun, and its first breath was our first genuine breath of long-awaited freedom.